Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for tuning in today to our first Symphony 21 interview. This is October 4th, 2020, and we're looking forward to our release of Aaron Graham's Kenopsia, recorded at the Chan Center in August 2020. Joining me today on today's call are Cary Wu, who is a professor of sociology at York University, and Dr. Aaron Graham, who just recently completed his doctorate in percussion performance at the University of British Columbia, and is also a very accomplished composer. Good morning to both of you.
Morning.
Good morning.
So the purpose of today, just for our viewers, is to learn a bit more about the piece itself and also learn a bit about the context and the reasons why it was written, and also how music can relate to the world around us and in more of a broader context than just in the concert hall. So Aaron, I'll start with you. Can you tell us when and why did you write this piece?
Sure. So I wrote the piece back in, it was 2017. I was a student at UBC at the time, University of British Columbia, and my percussion professor there, Vern Griffiths, was kind enough to allow me to occasionally write pieces for the UBC percussion ensemble, and so he invited me to, and was the reason that I wrote it, just because the ensemble was going to play it. So yeah, that was the main reason for writing.
So it's serendipitous then, or maybe not serendipitous, but ironic that then this happened 3 years later and it found a new place in current events. Cary, from a sociology perspective, what is the importance to our systems, to our human systems, to our economic systems, and just our way of life, to have spaces that are vibrant and full of people?
From a sociological perspective, yes, so sociological research have a has a long tradition of looking at how space, communities shape social life, right? So when vibrant place full of people means like social gatherings, social interactions, and this can produce a lot of benefits for individuals and also for societies. For example, for individuals, when we talk about social interactions, we learn a lot from interacting with each other, right? And then ideas are generated from social interaction. For example, the Harvard political scientist Putnam, he wrote a very famous book called Bowling Alone. Say people go bowling alone nowadays. The key argument is that over recent decades, people are less likely to engage with each other, interact with each other. And then this creates huge problems. For example, people are less willing to trust each other. And then people are less happier and less likely to engage with politics and all that. The other thing is that when we think about social interactions and full of people, there's a famous urban scholar called Jane Jacobs. She argued that when we have a lot of people, means a lot of eyes on the street, right? So the idea is when we have a lot of eyes on the street, then that create a safe environment, right? So then people density will lead to, in a sense, a lot of eyes could lead to lower crime and violence for places and neighborhoods.
Well, and it's interesting you bring up the bowling alley, because as our viewers will know, Kenopsia as a word means the feeling that you get standing in a place that used to be very crowded and now is empty, which obviously has a lot of, as you said, has been a sociological trend over the last few years, but also now has a renewed sense of relevancy in 2020.
Yeah.
Aaron, this feeling of Kenopsia, you obviously wrote this piece about it, but it was in 2017, as you mentioned, and now living in 2020 with social isolation and the rest of the impacts from COVID. Do you feel this Kenopsia personally? And if so, how has it impacted your life? And as an artist, how do you reconcile that?
Yeah, certainly. I think like most of us, I do have this emotion of just feeling very odd when I, get the seldom chance to go out into a public place where, that I'm used to, and I'm used to seeing a bunch of people out. So it's definitely a feeling that arises, like if I were to go on a university campus or go into a high school, it's certainly a feeling that is there, and this word describes it very well. And for me, I've just you know, as a composer, as a musician, I've taken the chance to do everything that I can at home. You know, luckily I practice writing. I try to take advantage of that as much as possible. And then this feeling when I'm out in public, I try to stay optimistic about the future. So it's, you know, I try to remember how normal life was, prior to COVID, and I just try to stay optimistic and look forward to when things return back to normal, hopefully soon. But for certain, it's a feeling that, like most of us, I'm sure it's, you know, I experienced it seldomly prior to COVID, but now it's become a very common kind of feeling when I go out into a public place.
Yeah, I think we can all relate. Cary, so obviously we're having this meeting over Zoom, and Zoom has kind of replaced our human interaction in many ways for the last now going on 8 months. You mentioned with regards to socialization and from a sociology point of view, the importance of having eyes on the street. Can digital spaces and digital activities, when we're looking at each other on the screen, does that really replace human-to-human interaction? And does it really help anyone with regards to our socialization and the lack of busy spaces?
I doubt that. I doubt that, right? So like face-to-face interaction is really important in terms of like with people in there. And then, for example, when we talk about socialization, from a young age, kids socialization, they have to play with their peers, right? They even social psychologists, they argue that even parents have a little impact on their children. The idea is that kids, they learn from playing with their other kids at the similar age. So they learn from playing with each other in person. So that's the one thing that maybe digital activities might not be able to replace in-person interactions. The other thing is that when we think about people in general, right, we learn from interacting people, but we in public spaces, we don't have to directly interact with others, right? It's just, we learn, for example, we pick up social cues from being there, watching people. And then this could also thinking about my own research. So one of my research looking at how like diversity reduce social bias or racial bias, or reduce discrimination, right? And then lead to trust people from different backgrounds. They don't have to interact with each other people. They just have to be there in a public space, and then they learn from watching people, right? From being there. So that is one, I think is a major reason when I'm thinking that like for people on the street is very important instead of like doing digital activities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think we're all hoping for the day when screens can be replaced with real people again.
Yeah.
Aaron, from a musical standpoint, so now that we're learning a bit more about Kenopsia and the ideas behind it, and also the sociological impact that that word and that feeling has on us and how relevant it is in 2020, when you were theorizing of writing a piece called Kenopsia, obviously you're not knowing what 2020 had in store at the time, but now looking back on it, when we recorded the piece and when you look back on your composition, from a musical standpoint, we talk a lot about programmatic elements. So that's stuff in music that can speak to a storyline or is representative. So for example, if you want to have a bird call in a piece, you might have a high flute with a little trill on it. When you were writing Kenopsia, did you make a conscious decision to include any of those programmatic type elements in it? And is there anything specific in the piece that our listeners can watch out for that really represents the idea of Kenopsia in your mind?
Yeah, definitely. I found, I don't know if you feel this as a composer, but I feel like when I go to start writing a new piece, I am typically way more successful if I can internalize as much of the piece as I can before, you know, even writing a pitch down or picking a rhythm. You know, what I mean when I say that is internalizing just the kind of emotions I want to show in the piece, just the general arc of the piece, and you know, just having as much you know, as much as I can internalized about the piece before I actually start writing anything. And so, I certainly did that when I started writing Kenopsia. I tried to think about this feeling, and maybe the listeners can empathize with, you know, this feeling of walking through a place where typically there's people all around you, and you know, and you start to see like the spaces, and out of the corner of your eye you start to see the little nooks and crannies and things of this area that you had never seen before, just because there's typically so many people and so much going on. So to me, that feeling in the piece, I try to include a lot of kind of chatter, kind of accompaniment. And so the piece is divided in kind of three main sections. And in the first two sections, you'll hear, in the first section, you'll hear some high keyboard instruments playing this kind of chatter accompaniment underneath the melodic material that's going on. It'll be the xylophone and the glockenspiel. And so to me, it's just kind of a feeling of, when you're walking through a place, you know, maybe it feels like you're just kind of seeing movement out of the corner of your eye, just because you're so used to typically seeing so much movement in a place. So there's always this kind of undercurrent of movement and chatter, and you'll kind of hear that in the first two sections. Like I said, in the first section, it'll be xylophone and glockenspiel, and then in the second section, you'll hear a bunch of staccato kind of what I've always heard called like ricky-ticky kind of sounds and accompaniment. So just that kind of chatter, that's what that is meant to symbolize, is that kind of feeling of, you know, seeing something scuttle in the shadows, that kind of feeling. And then one, you know, I was trying to think about this, other aspects. This feeling, it kind of brings, you know, it just seems like something is odd or something is off when you're walking through a space because there's nobody there. And so I wanted to try and show, or just try and have a general feeling that at certain points of the piece, things aren't going the way you expect them to go. And so you'll hear about kind of halfway through the first section, so maybe about a minute or two into the piece, things get very chromatic, or just things just get very they get very crunchy, is a musical word I like to use, and it gets, things start sounding like they shouldn't be there, and it just sounds like it's kind of moving in a precarious kind of direction. So that happens in the first section, and then you'll hear that again towards the end of the piece. So that's just meant to symbolize that kind of odd feeling of something being off that you feel when you walk through a space like this.
Yeah, and you know, conducting your piece when we recorded it in August, I definitely picked up on some of that. So I'm glad that I was on the right track. Cary, you kind of mentioned this already, especially how important it is for children to be socializing face to face, but I assume, you know, a lot of that translates to adults. And I know personally, being socially isolated, and I think I speak for everyone, is a really difficult thing. What is it about face-to-face interaction that keeps us healthy and happy that can't really be reproduced through a screen? And, you know, when we talk about human socialization, is this something that is, you know, really unique to humans, or how are humans, we spend a lot of our lives, I guess, compared to the animal world, in our own little bubble, in our cars, in our houses, in our little cubicle at work. But are we really, you know, as much as, say, pack animals as other beings we observe in the natural world? And how does that sense of belonging to a community really keep us healthy and happy?
Great questions. Yeah, so like, I think that I would say that a lot of different ways, or like process or mechanism, like linking how face-to-face interaction lead to like better health or higher level of happiness. Right? So like socialization or social isolation, those could lead to, for example, mental health. So for my research, one major mechanism is about trust, right? Trust, I mean trust people in general. So like whether people can trust in others they don't personally know, right? So this type of trust can only be generated by face-to-face interactions. And a lot of research say that generalized trust, this type of trust, can explain people's health and happiness. So that's why even like, for example, there's a book called The Village Effect, by Susan Pinker. So like she in the book, her argument is about how like the village, people being together, can lead to health, lead to happiness, and then also like make people even smarter, or like the city being a smarter city. So that's the village effect. So from a sociological perspective, like there's a book I think by so called Dying Alone. So like it's similar to bowling alone. It's dying alone. So that book, sociologist at NYU. So his name is Aaron Cullenberg. So his argument, he researched into the 1995 Chicago heat wave, right? So he talked about like why so many people died from the 1995 Chicago heat wave. The argument is that it's more than a natural disaster, right? It's more a social disaster. So a lot of people die because there's no trust in each other, or there's no help within each other when people are isolated, right? So, and he compared for example, two neighborhoods or two communities. One is Latino communities, and other is African American communities. And he showed that like death rate is much lower among Latino communities. So the reason is that because there's more people getting together in Latino communities. Latinos, they are more likely to interact with each other in neighborhood. But then when the heat wave came, a lot of African American communities were abandoned, right? So the main argument, he compared these two differences in terms of face-to-face interaction or community interaction, and that explains the death rate from the heat wave in Chicago. So that in general, so that we could argue that a lot of evidence showing that face-to-face interaction could lead to more trust and more like helping behavior, and that explains, for example, health and happiness, life satisfaction.
Well, and it's interesting talking about the idea of trust and how certain communities are disproportionately affected, and that sadly, continues in 2020, as we've seen with the fallout of COVID, and how certain communities are disproportionately affected as opposed to others, and how that's probably, as you said, all being compounded by the social isolation and the effects of that. So that's really, really interesting and relevant.
Yes. I have published 2 papers now looking at how trust and social capital, social connections lead to lower exposure to COVID-19 and lower the death rate among like American like counties, or we use data looking at how like county level social capital and the social interaction actually explain the lower death rate of COVID-19.
Mm-hmm. Wow, interesting. Really, really amazing work that you're doing. A few more questions for both of you. Just wrapping up here, Aaron, you wrote Kenopsia before COVID, obviously, and it was remarkable foresight on your part to be able to predict, what was going to happen in 3 years. You mentioned as an artist, finding ways to reconcile what it's like to be a musician and be a creative person during the hardships, both socially and, otherwise, in every aspect of life, it seems, in 2020. But as a musician myself as well, obviously, I know that the creativity doesn't stop, and that, artists, not just in music, but in all practices, are finding ways to be representative of the time that they're living in and the challenges that they're living in. So having written Kenopsia about social isolation, is there anything that you're working on now, given that we're living through this, that, in the same vein that you're looking to represent how 2020 and COVID and isolation has affected you?
Yeah, certainly. So as a percussionist, which is, I'm a composer, but I'm a percussionist primarily too. The instruments we play may be fortunately and unfortunately, most of them are quite loud, or they can be quite loud when if you want to practice and perform. So, me and my wife living in a building that we share with other people, crash cymbals and timpani and snare drum are not the most conducive and friendly instruments to play at home, as you might imagine. So I find myself, not being able to get out and practice these instruments. I've been playing a lot of softer instruments. I've been playing a lot of marimba more than I ever have in my whole life, and I've taken this opportunity. I have kind of an informal video series on my YouTube channel titled Quarantine, where I've just been exploring arrangements of popular songs and marimba compositions, and all on the marimba. So it's kind of exercising my the musician in me, or the percussionist in me, as well as a bit of the composer in me as well. So certainly that's out of necessity. I've been playing more marimba than crash cymbals over the past 6 months. And then just as a composer, I'm working on a couple projects, and I find that I'm much more aware and much more careful of what the rehearsal process will be, and what the performance situation will be. So I'm one half of a percussion duo called Symphony 2 with a good friend of ours, Julia Chen, and I'm writing a piece for snare drum and tabla, and we have some other pieces picked out that we are hoping to start working on, but we have to be very careful just about how we can rehearse them, and how we can can we rehearse them in a safe way, and when we go to perform, can we will we be able to set up and perform in a safe way, and will it be conducive to this situation we find ourselves in? So that, I've been working on writing a few other things over the past 6 months, but that's a huge consideration, much more than prior to COVID, is is it safe for these musicians to be in close quarters and rehearse this, or is there a way to write it so that when they rehearse and perform, can they socially distance, of course. So there's a lot of precautions and new considerations to take in mind when writing, and yeah.
Yeah, and it's interesting you bring some of that up. In a week, actually, for our next premiere, we'll be talking to Wendy Atkinson from the Chan Center, as well as Dr. Jonathan Gerard from the UBC School of Music, and Ron Cohen-Mann, a freelancer in Ontario, all very different experiences as a musician, as musicians rather, but all communicating and reflecting similar to what you're saying, in that it's, this is really changing the industry of music and the arts in general. But as hard as it is, it's heartening that yourself and composers and creators all over the world are finding ways to adapt. And I think that just shows the power of art to sustain itself and sustain, ourselves as a larger human community. So that's fantastic to hear. Cary, last question for you. You've done a lot of work and research, as you said, on how systems of socialization and interaction, as you said, affect health, affect happiness, affect things like trust, and the detriments of when those things are removed. Going forward, given that COVID seems to be with us for quite a while longer, and given that so many parts of Canada and indeed the world are experiencing a fairly severe second wave, and some predictions are not until the fall of 2021 will things even start to move in a direction of pre-COVID, how do you predict, just as Aaron said, musicians adapting to the current situation, how do you predict, as this goes on, our broader humanity adapting to combat the struggles of social isolation? And how do you predict that will create some changes in, in systems that we use to just even function on a daily basis?
Yeah, so like human beings also adapting to the new norm, right? So like, for example, in university, in schools, a lot of things gonna go online, even in a lot of other industries, like a lot of things gonna go online. So for us, for example, when we teach, we need to learn how to better teach in terms of interact with students online. And then from students' perspective, they need to learn how to better learn, right? How to follow along, how to kind of like new ways of interaction with people online, especially for like this year or maybe next. Like it's not gonna be everything not gonna be returned to normal, or is there a new normal? When we have a new normal, then we need to learn how to adapt to that new normal society. So people learn new things to be like sociable, for example, or to how to interact, how to learn from each other. So a lot of things will be online. And then the other thing is like people also learn a lot from the pandemic, right? So how to be in terms of like stay healthy, or how to be more be more polite with each other, or have concerns about each other's health, right? So that we learn from the pandemic. So this is like a process like we have to adapt to. So in terms of the pandemic, we learn from the pandemic. We also need to improve our ways of interacting with others, and how for university students or students in high school, we need to learn how to like better learn or interact.
So not all is lost, is what I hear what you're saying, and that, you know, we can, even though things are changing so much, that, you know, as human beings we can adapt and learn, and you know, not let this, as you said, the sociological crisis compound the health crisis at the same time going forward. So
yeah,
that's heartening to hear. Well, thank you both so much again for being a part of this, and especially our first interview series. It's really great to have you know, such leaders in your respective fields able to talk to myself and all of our Symphony 21 viewers, and I know that I enjoyed it very much. We'll post some links in our YouTube video to maybe Aaron's YouTube page, and maybe some of your work, Cary, so that our listeners can continue their discovery of some of these themes. And beyond that, I hope to talk to both of you soon in some other context down the road. Hopefully, Aaron, you don't need to write another piece in 3 years about some other thing. Hopefully this will be it. And Cary, hopefully your research will you know, your next paper will be how humans, you know, overcame and adapted and learned new ways of interacting with each other, and, you know, it becomes a seminal moment in our evolution. So without further ado, I invite you to stay with us on YouTube and experience with us Aaron Graham's Kenopsia.